Welcome to the lesson on week 12. This week, we're going to go over technical reports, and it'll be a fairly lengthy lesson because after we go through what technical reports are, what is expected of your group's technical report, then we're going to discuss the different kinds of visuals that you want to learn about for future report writing, but also what to include and how to format it properly for the technical report that your group is going to submit. When we look at week 12 on Canvas, technical reports, design, graphs, charts, and so on is the title of the lesson. And when we first approach understanding what technical reports are, you'll see that there's a list here of different names, different kinds of reports. Any job that you go to and any class you're in, you're going to have a slightly new report taught to you. There are these overall ideas of what different kinds of reports are made, but when you go to a different company, further in your career, when you're at your internship, when you're in another course, these are all customized to the needs of that class, that organization, what's being put into the report, the purpose of it, and who the audience is. So you want to familiarize yourself with this vocabulary, but there aren't necessarily always exact rules for what is contained in each of these kinds of reports. And there are more reports than what's listed here, but these are some of the better known ones. The same is true with the sections that are contained within various reports. So here you have a list of different sections that you want to become familiar with the vocabulary of, understand what purpose they serve. But again, you might find more sections than this, different sections than this when you begin to work on reports in different courses and different positions that you have in your career. The three most commonly highlighted reports are the feasibility report, the recommendation report, and the evaluation report. And as you read these brief descriptions of what each of them are, you'll see that there isn't a huge distinction between the three. Feasibility report stands out the most from the other two, but oftentimes feasibility is sometimes included with a recommendation, with an evaluation. And so you might find that all three of these are combined into one kind of report that you're assigned to do. For this class, you'll also see that there's somewhat of an overlap between these three kinds, mainly between the recommendation report, the evaluation report, and then also combining some ideas of research reports. For this class, the technical report that you are going to write includes two major ideas. One is what your recommendation is. So over the course of all of these weeks, you've brainstormed with your partner, you've researched, you've gotten feedback from me, you've written an instruction manual, you're going to receive usability test results back from peers. So at this point, your idea has most likely modified over the course of the semester. And now you've come down to, okay, this is what we realize is going to be the final design and mechanics of the game that we're going to submit. Therefore, you're going to provide your recommendation. What is this game idea that you have? What are all the elements and aspects of it that you want to communicate to your audience? However, that's not just enough to include. You also have to have sections throughout the report that explains the data that led you to your decisions. So you're not writing a narrative about, oh, week one, I did this and learned this. Week two, I did this and learned this. Instead, what you're doing is you're taking all of those most important pieces of data, research, experiences that you've gone through, and you're including those throughout the report to let your reader understand why your recommendation, why your idea has value and is a good idea for them. So they want to be able to see what led you to your decisions so that they can also determine for themselves that they agree based on this research, based on this logic, based on your findings, that your idea is a good idea for them. As you move through this list of different items in bold. These are all of the required sections that you're going to have in your report. And I explain what the expectations are for each of those sections. You need to include them in the order that they appear here. And you need to include these exact section headings, subheadings, and so forth. Each section of your report is going to start on a new page. And so we're calling those each major section. So title page is its own page. Executive summary starts at the top of the second page. And then even with your introduction, the introduction itself is going to be its own page. However, you have 2 subsections in there. And so all of that will be included on the one page, or however long it ends up taking to include all of this information. Then you'll move on, start a new page with game description. So it's possible some of these sections will only be half a page. Some of these sections will be 2 pages, but no matter where the section ends, when you start the next major section, it begins on its own page. For the title page, you'll see the requirements here that need to be included on that page. And then the second page will be the executive summary. Executive summaries are really important documents that you want to practice and learn how to write. What they do is they use your critical thinking skills to imagine the needs of a very specific reader. That reader is upper management usually, who doesn't have either the time or the interest to read through your entire report. But they do want to be able to have a voice in the decision making. And so they want to feel like they know enough to be able to say yes or no to accepting your idea. And then maybe if something intrigues them, they'll look further at a specific section in the report. But for the most part, they want to be able to get all the important information that they need quickly and clearly in one single page. So what you want to do is, even though this page comes very early on in the report, you're going to write it last. Because essentially what you're going to do is go through your report after you're pretty much ready to submit it. And you're going to figure out what is the most important, significant research, findings, ideas that I have in this report that will serve this reader, that will help them make a decision without having to read all the other details that are in your report. So you can't just give an overview. It's not that you're writing a general summary of your report. You're giving very specific details, but you're not giving all the details. So as you've been practicing all semester, what is it that my reader needs to know here? And what is it that they don't need to know in order to make a decision? So leaving out the fluff, but also leaving out some important information throughout the rest of your report, just because it's not the most significant. So again, it's essentially like taking your report, picking out certain information and data and organizing it for this specific reader and putting it into one page. There's a note below about writing style for the report, which we'll go over in a minute, but just to remind you here, this document is not a sales document. You're not selling anything to a consumer. So when you're speaking from one professional to another professional, avoid that kind of sales writing that you might see on a product packaging. This person wants to know your expertise. They want to know your knowledge. They want to understand what it is that you're trying to communicate to them about your idea and about why it has value for them. And they don't want to try to be marketed something at this point, or anywhere really within this report. Then you'll have a page that includes both your table of contents and table of figures. And you'll see here an explanation of how that should be laid out. For your report, you're required to include at least 2 figures throughout the report and at least one table. Oftentimes there'll be more than that in the report, but you need to make sure that you have at least 2 figures, which covers these kinds of visuals, and at least 1 table in the report. And so then those will go in your table of figures that appears underneath the table of contents. Then you have your introduction section. You're going to start with a very brief description of your game. So if this is the first page that somebody turns to because they're ready to sit down and read your entire report, they don't know anything else about your game, they've never heard of it before, right? Because this is the first time you're contacting University Games. What's a brief description of the game that will help them feel grounded in understanding what it is that they're about to read about? So I don't imagine that with the purpose statement sentence and then a sentence or 2 about your about your game, that this paragraph should be any longer than maybe 3 to 5 sentences at the most, no more than 5 sentences, generally maybe about 3. Underneath that, you're going to include 2 subsections. The subheading, or what we call the level 2 heading, will be type and genre of game. And it's pretty self-explanatory here what you're writing about. You're identifying the different type, the specific type of game that your idea falls into, and the specific genre of game that your idea falls into. You want to briefly explain what each of those are, and then get into a little bit more detail. Again, we're not looking for more than a paragraph to about how your game idea fits in to that type and genre. I have a document here that gives you an idea of the different types of genres that exist. You can use that as your source when you explain what the type and genre are, or you can find a reliable source on your own and use that. The next level 2 heading is going to be closest comparisons. And in this subsection, you identify maybe just 1 or 2 existing games that are already being sold on the market, but are not being sold by University Games that have similarities to your game. And so you'll identify what those 2 games are. You'll provide research that you found that explains the benefits and or success of those games, and then describe how your game is similar and different from that game that's already on the market. You're welcome to include helpful visuals and data throughout this section, but you don't have to, it's not required that you have any visuals here. But if you have charts or images that are relevant, that makes sense to include here, this might be a good place to do that. And then its own 1-line paragraph by itself at the end of this section is going to be a final line that includes a preview statement that briefly explains or lists the remaining sections of the report. Then you're going to move into the game description. You have 2 subsections here, a description of the game. So you gave a very brief description in the introduction, and now you're moving into a longer description here. And then you're going to explain the target audience and user experience of your game. It's really important here that when you're describing your game, you're doing so as how you would describe the game, not to a player. This isn't the instruction manual. You're not copying your instruction manual and pasting it into here. You're putting into paragraph form for a professional audience who's interested in possibly buying your game idea. You're giving them some of the key mechanics, themes, steps that players take in order to play the game. So you do not need to go into as much depth as you do in the instruction manual. You don't format it like you would in an instruction manual. You might have a list, a short list here and there to identify some steps or list of equipment or something, but it's not going to be an instruction manual. You want to provide enough information that the reader feels they understand the game, what the players do and how they win. But again, this is not intended for someone who's about to play your game. So you want to read this paragraph more in detail. And then you're going to write your target audience and user experience section, where you're going to identify and explain your game's target audiences. We've had quite a few lessons now about what a target audience is and how to identify and describe it. So go back to my feedback on your previous documents, go back to those lessons so that you understand what is expected of you here. You want to incorporate research that you find about their demographics, their interests, their gaming experience and abilities, and any other additional research about the target audience that you believe is important, right, in relation to your game idea. You're going to explain how your game benefits your target audiences if it does, and explain how the research that you've now presented about your target audience and their gaming interests, their gaming abilities, how that relates to your game concept and mechanics. So I put a little example here about, let's say that you know your target audience is 15 to 30-year-olds, and this makes sense for your game because you've done research that this group of players have shown through studies, different kinds of data that you found, that they have more interest in playing games that include more people than just a one-on-one game. So they seem to be more interested in socializing through gameplay and being around larger groups of people. Let's say that's the research you found about 15 to 30-year-olds who are your target audience. So then you'll explain, well, how does that relate to the way your game is designed? Well, your game, again, is for this target audience group, and it must be played with no fewer than 5 players, which means that your game is a good match for the interest of the target audience who wants to play games with larger amounts of people. Again, here, any helpful visuals of different kind of data that you find that's relevant, you can put in this section. What's really important to understand about visuals is that you're not throwing them in there just for the sake of having a visual. You need to think about, well, what purpose does this visual serve? How does it help communicate the main ideas, the significant information that I'm trying to communicate to my audience, but familiarize them with as well? And only include that visual that serves a purpose and is helpful for your reader and helpful for you to get your idea across. Again, it's not required here, but it's suggested that this is probably a good area if you have these kinds of visuals to include them. Then you're going to explain your research methods and your results. You're going to have a subsection called sources, and you're going to write a paragraph about each source that you've included in your report up until this point, and that is included after this point. The way you're going to format that is you're going to write out the complete citation for each source, so the way that you would write it in a references page. And then you're going to alphabetize the sources based on that complete citation. So oftentimes it'll be the first word in the citation will be the first word of the article title if there's no author. It might be the first word of the company that publishes the website where that source appeared, if again, there's no author, or it might be the last name of an author of that source. And so you need to figure out what the alphabetical order is based on that first word or name in each of the sources. And then once you have your first complete citation, that's first alphabetically, next to that source, you're going to write one paragraph that includes just these things here. So how did you locate the source? So where did you find it? So that your reader can understand that you went through a reliable or credible method to locate your source. or at least some sort of rationale. Then you want to briefly summarize the source's content. Here again, you're using your critical thinking skills to condense the entire source down to only 2 or 3 sentences. You're not going to explain in multiple sentences, in multiple paragraphs, all the information that is included in that source, article, whatever it may be. Instead, you want to figure out if this author were to tell somebody else, hey, this is the main idea and the main points of my total document, what would that be in 2 to 3 sentences? You don't want to plagiarize the source when you do this. So go back to the lesson on research to make sure that you're paraphrasing correctly. And then if you decide to use a quote, you can't have your entire summary be made up of a quote, but you can use parts of the source to help give some information that you can't put in your own words. And then you want to make sure that you're formatting that quotation and citing it correctly. In this paragraph, then, you're going to explain why this source is credible. And I've got links to some other websites that help clarify the definition of these different words. Essentially, what you're going to do is based on the reliability of the publisher or the organization that published the source, based on the expertise or profession of the authors, based on the date that the source was published, and based on the value of the content. You're going to explain why this source is useful and credible for this report. When I talk about the value of the content, I gave you some examples here so that you can get a better idea of what that means. And then if there is any other information that you think adds to the credibility, reliability, or value of the source, then please go ahead and add that as well. I have a couple of notes here about research and credibility. One is a reminder that Wikipedia is not an acceptable source, so that can't appear as a source in your report. And also there are links to the week 9 lesson for you to go back and understand again, how do I evaluate a source? How do I know if it's credible and reliable? And then also this tutorial on the University of Kansas that goes through this idea of credibility in research. The next subsection in the research methods with results major section is the usability test analysis. So first, you're going to explain why you conducted usability tests for your game. Okay, it's not because you were assigned to by your professor. Go back, understand what usability tests are, what their value is in the week 11 lesson. And then in a couple of sentences, explain in your own words why you conducted usability tests to help with the development of your game idea. Then you're going to briefly describe how the tests were conducted, how you observed the test. So that's a pretty direct statement or two about the fact that that your users downloaded the instruction manual, recorded themselves reading through the instruction manual, gathering the materials, building the game, and playing the game. And that then you were able to watch back that video and also received a questionnaire from your users who answered some clarifying questions about what their experience was like. You also want to briefly explain the demographics about the users who did the testing. You're not going to include their names. You don't want to identify anybody because of privacy reasons in general when you're doing these kinds of tests and writing about them. But you already know some of the demographic information about your users, and you can ask them for additional information if they feel comfortable sharing it, which, like I said, would not be their name, but it could be their year at the university, if they're a sophomore, freshman, what their specific major is, mechanical engineering or so forth, and what their age is, what their gender is. And that also might be helpful demographic information to include. Then you're going to practice thinking about what's the most important information that you got from analyzing each of the tests and from reading the questionnaire responses. You're not going to give all of the information that you got from those two methods, but you're going to pick out the most important findings and observations, the ones that were most important to you, and include what some of the negative feedback was that you got, what some of the positive feedback was that you received from each user, and explain that those were the ones that helped influence your revision of the instruction manual. So you're summarizing the important feedback you received that influenced your choice of revisions to the instruction manual. The last major section of the report is the recommendation. In here, you're explaining in probably 2 paragraphs, 1 to 2 paragraphs, why you're making the recommendation that you are. So your reader has already read what your game is, has an understanding of how people play it, understands your target audience, understands the research that you've conducted, and now you're sort of merging some of that together to explain some of the key information that you've already given in earlier parts of the report into this shorter and merged 1 to 2 paragraphs. And the purpose of doing so is to justify why your game idea is your final recommendation. You're not going to go through a report and copy and paste sentences and just stack them together one after the other into a paragraph. Instead, you're taking a step back, using your critical thinking skills again, and you're going to take some of the main points in your report and directly relate them to why your game is a good fit for university games, not just because of the call for ideas that they put out, but because of what you now know about university games as an actual company. And then also how it meets the criteria for the call for ideas. Be very careful to understand that this is not an executive summary. You go back and compare the explanation of those 2 different sections, but the executive summary is different than this recommendation section. One of the key differences is that the executive summary has a different audience. Here's another note about this sales type of writing that you are avoiding. And I explain here again what I explained earlier about why you want to avoid that sales type of writing and how to think about your writing to avoid it. Then you have your conclusion. So the first paragraph is just a brief summary again of some of the main findings in your report. It's going to be much shorter than what's in your recommendation. It might just be a sentence, 2 sentences. And then you'll have a second paragraph after that. So remember, you have short paragraphs that are focused. You're not expected to necessarily have a 6-sentence paragraph all the time. In this case, the first paragraph might only be 1 to 2 sentences, but it has a very specific purpose and it has very specific content in it. And then the second paragraph of the conclusion will include a brief, clear statement of what action you hope the reader will take. And then you'll have a third paragraph that again is short, that includes just a few sentences, maybe just 1 or 2, that thanks the reader for their opportunity and that they can contact you with any questions or follow-up communication that they may have. Then you're going to have your references page. You're going to use the many sources that I've given you up until this point to format your references page in APA citation style. Please go back to the research lesson in week 9, because I will check to see if all of the sources listed in your references page actually appear in your report, right? Because that's one of the requirements that you learned in week 9, and that all the sources that you've incorporated into your report then appear and correspond correctly to the list of citations in the references page. Some students find that a glossary is helpful You might just have some specialized terms throughout your report that you can explain within the main text. But if you feel that there is a longer list of vocabulary that you think your readers at University Gaines need, then you can put that in this glossary at the end. It's not required. It's not even encouraged if it's not something that you need. And lastly, an appendix. Again, this is not required, but an appendix is really helpful for keeping your report readable. So early on in the semester, you learned about the readability of documents for professional and technical writing. And you want to make sure that if you have any visuals, large chunks of data, questionnaire samples, anything like that that you want to include in your report, but that is going to take up too much space within the report itself. Like you have a questionnaire sample, which you're not required to give, but for some reason, maybe it's really important. You understand for yourself that that's important for you to include in your document. It wouldn't fit to have all of a sudden a whole page of a sample document in your report. Instead, that's something that you would put in the appendix. And in the body of your report, you will refer to it. So you'll explain it, describe it, wherever it's necessary in the report, and then you'll say, and then you'll write see Appendix A, if that's where it appears. Note that the instruction manual and the prototype are not appendices. Okay, those are not appendix documents. Those are additional pieces that you're submitting as part of this final package. So you have a technical report, which is going to have all this information that we just went through, and then separate, not as an appendix, not as an enclosure, but just part of the final package, you have your instruction manual and prototype image. Okay, now for the other important section of this lesson is the writing style for your report and the design style. So here is a checklist of some of the formatting that you need to follow and professional style and tone of writing that you need to include into your report. And then we go into page design for a report such as this, using headings, understanding how headings are used, what the limitations are for headings. You don't want to use heavily stylized multiple kinds of headings. So read this to get a better understanding of that. Here's a sample. For example, here, this is the main section heading. It's got Roman numeral 2, all caps, bold, centered. This isn't required for your report, but it's an example of how some professionals use headings in their documents. So they have their first level heading. He always begins a new page, right? Yours doesn't have to look exactly like this, but comparatively, they have a second level heading, which introduces their subsection. They have another second level heading for another subsection. And then within that subsection, they have 2 third level headings. And so it's not overwhelming with the different types of styles that they're using to distinguish between these different level headings, but it's clear that there are these sections and subsections throughout this report just by looking at this. What I was just talking about not over stylizing the fonts and headings and different kinds of content that you have in your document. In general, that's called highlighting. It doesn't mean just highlighting it in blue like I've done here, but it's all the different style options that are available to you. So you want to follow these important guidelines for using different highlighting schemes. There are different kinds of margins and indentation and alignment for a technical report that you want to pay attention to. Avoiding too many different kinds of fonts and colors, incorporating lists and how to do so properly, and then incorporating the visuals into your report. So here you want to read about what I mean by graphics in this lesson, their purpose, the design style for tables, which is different than for figures, The use of tables, the formatting of how you refer to a table in the text of your document, and then how you format the actual table within that document. And then similarly for charts and graphs. When you document your tables, charts, and graphs, if you get them from a source, you need to indicate that, and you need to properly cite the source for where that visual came from. And then I reiterate here some of these general requirements for incorporating tables, charts, and graphs into your document. Don't skip all this important information above here, but this may be helpful to reinforce what you've just read about what's required. And then I have a video here. It's fairly short about incorporating graphics into a report. And I think that this is really helpful to take a few minutes to watch, because sometimes there's a way that I describe it through this video. I describe it in my lesson that's not quite clicking and understandable for you. And so here's an opportunity to take a few minutes to hear somebody else vocalize the importance and the requirements around incorporating graphics into your report. You should all be familiar by now what happened with examples for the proposal assignment and how you can find the examples of the technical reports so that you have them there to use ethically and to use responsibly, but to not use in replace of the lesson. And then for this week, you'll click on the assignment post for week 12 when you're going to conduct your usability test. There are very specific guidelines on how to conduct the usability test, how to post the video and questionnaire. In order to start this assignment, you're going to go back into the week 11 assignment post to locate a peer who posted directly above you and download their instruction manual. You're going to use a webcam or your cell phone camera to get a large enough picture of you reading the instruction manual and gathering and putting together the materials and playing. You also want to make sure that you're recording audio, because throughout the video, as you learned in the usability test lesson, you want to be reading out loud as you go, voicing your thoughts and opinions, noting any areas that are unclear, any concerns or thoughts that come to mind as you're moving through the instruction manual. And then in this week 12 assignment post, you're going to have just one post that at the top has the name of the peer whose instruction manual you tested. You're going to include the video recording file. In the past, this video file is too large. It takes a very long time to upload to the Canvas assignment post. So instead, what I encourage you to do is upload the video onto Google Drive and then simply post the share link to that Google Drive video in your post. And that way I have access to it and your peers have access to it. You must make sure that when you look at the share link that it says, who has access to view this item, so that when I click on it, it's there, and when your peers click on it, they don't have any access issues. And then in that same post to this assignment, you're going to have a written portion where you answer the following questions about your experience and your thoughts on the instruction manual. So make sure that you're already starting to actively work on your technical report with your peer, doing as much as you can start to do at this point, which is there's still plenty that you can get done without having received the usability test results back yet. And that then once you get the usability questions and video back from your peers, that you look at those to review to start revising in any way that's been suggested that you realize you need to do. So that's it for week 12. Any questions, as always, contact me, visit me during office hours, whether they're open office hours or make an appointment. Reach out to me if a time outside of my office hours works better for you or you and your partner. And then also post in the discussion about assignments that we have on Canvas.